Are you mad right now? There was an article in the Houston Chronicle this week that caught my attention. Americans are angry. Let me read a little bit from the article. The country erupted into the worst civil unrest in decades after the death of George Floyd, and anger about police violence and the country's legacy of racism is still running high. At the same time, we're dealing with anger provoked by the coronavirus pandemic, anger at public officials because they've shut down parts of society, or anger because they aren't doing enough to curb the virus, anger about being required to wear a mask, or anger toward people who refuse to wear a mask, anger with anyone who doesn't see things the right way. We're living, in effect, in a big anger incubator, says Raymond Navaco, a psychology professor at the University of California, Irvine, who has expertise in anger assessment and treatment. So, and the article goes on to talk about kind of the obvious that we are, as a society, angrier. People report higher levels of anger recently. According to psychiatrist Joshua Morgenstein, the country is now dealing with 3 disasters superimposed on top of one another: the pandemic, the economic fallout, and the civil unrest. Disasters, or maybe you could call them crises. Certainly one way of responding, and a common way of responding, is anger, says Morgenstein. Although some anger is inevitable, it becomes a problem when it is sustained or there are reoccurring bouts without the use of positive coping tools, says Damon Tweedy, associate professor of psychiatry at Duke University. Unmanaged anger can erupt into aggressive behavior against others, a particular concern now, domestic violence, and experts believe children at home with abusive parents are in increased danger. If this describes you or anybody you know, please don't hesitate to call and get help. But this may apply to a lot of us. This next part that I'm going to read here. Anger can also harm our own health by affecting the cardiovascular, neurological, and endocrine systems. So when you read that tweet, if you're on Twitter, Facebook, whatever, you read that newspaper headline, and you have those thoughts about that family member who's posted that thing, or that politician who's driving you mad, who are you hurting? Physiologically, your anger is eating at you. Your health is being disrupted by anger. Well then, what does God have to do with all of this? What does he say about all this? I grew up thinking that there was such a thing as righteous anger. I don't know if you've ever heard this term. A lot of times people like to talk about the story where Jesus went into the temple and flipped over some tables, the money changers, and actually got a whip and started like hitting at people and driving them out. You don't see any like kids cartoons about the time Jesus went mad in the temple. Mad not in the sense of being insane, but mad about like just being really mad. Zeal for your house will consume me, is the Old Testament text says, zeal for your house will consume me. Later on in the Gospels, the gospel writers say, oh, that's what's going on here. Jesus just had a lot of zeal for his Father's house. And of course, the step that we take from there is, well, if Jesus does it, then it's okay for us too. A couple years ago, I'm going to share a little bit from an essay that I ran across a couple years ago. One of my former seminary professors who just retired, Jeff Gibbs, wrote a piece called The Myth of Righteous Anger. And what he explored is, he looked at the Bible, and is righteous anger a real thing? There's a lot of occasions in the Bible, and not as many occasions about Jesus getting angry, although it's more than just the temple incident. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees. There are times Jesus' anger is palpable. A whole lot of times in the Old Testament when God is really mad at Israel. I mean, we got chapters and chapters of God just venting his anger at Israel and telling them what he's going to do in that anger. But the question isn't, can God be angry? The question is, should you be angry? I think of the end of the book of Jonah. Jonah is mad at God because God didn't destroy the Ninevites. He forgave them instead of for destroying them. And then Jonah went to pout, and when he was pouting, it was this hot day, kind of like we're having right now, and there's this plant that grows over Jonah, and then the plant, this vine that he was using for shade, withers and dies. And then Jonah's even more mad at God. Not only did you not destroy the Ninevites, you wrecked my vine. And God comes to Jonah and says, do you have any right to be angry? Yeah. Do you have a right to be mad about either the Ninevites or this vine? Jonah says, yes. That's kind of how the story ends. Jonah's just mad. I hope he got over it. Hope for all of our sakes we get over some of the anger that is hurting us and perhaps hurting our relationship with God. So let me read to you a little bit from what Dr. Gibbs writes. He quotes from Ephesians 4. Paul writes, therefore, having put away falsehood, let each one of you speak the truth with his neighbor, for we are members of one another. Be angry and do not sin. I command that the sun not go down on your anger, and give no opportunity to the devil. Here's what Gibbs writes about that verse. It does seem valid to remark that Paul allows that anger is not automatically sinful. This is, however, hardly a rousing endorsement of righteous anger. To the contrary, so dangerous is anger that Paul immediately warns against sin. Indeed, the apostle hastens to add that unless a believer guards himself and gets rid of his anger, he has left an opportunity for the devil. It seems clear enough that Ephesians 4 is part of the New Testament's almost exclusively negative judgment of anger in man. James 1 reads, know this, my beloved brothers, let every person be quick to speak. Freudian slip, maybe. Let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger, for the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God. Be slow to anger. The anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God. Here's Gibbs' comment on that. The most one can say here is that, like in Ephesians, James allows the possibility that anger is not sinful. After all, be slow to speak doesn't mean don't speak at all. So also, to be slow to anger doesn't necessarily mean don't ever be angry. The clause that follows, however, reveals James's understanding that human anger on the part of Jesus' disciples is a dangerous proposition, and all too often fails to conform to the ways that God wants to put things right in the world. Does God want to fix things through your anger? At most, as in Ephesians 4, the apparent concession is followed at once by the verse which rejects anger. So here's Gibbs's conclusion. Is there such a thing as righteous anger? With regard to sinful human creatures, the answer is theoretically possible. Nowhere, however, are we commanded to act in righteous anger, and even when it seems a possibility, there is an immediate warning against sinning. Gibbs says, for what it's worth, I suspect the category of righteous anger most of the time is a smokescreen, an attempt to justify sarcasm and punitive actions and angry insults. Which then leads to the question, what should Christians do with our anger? And Gibbs has some great stuff here. I'm going to keep reading. There is wise counsel in having a third party to whom I can express my anger. A safe and careful listener can be a great help in letting me dispel some of the energy that's inside of me, the energy that could so quickly manifest itself in the form of attacking another person rather than loving them. Gibbs says, to use a somewhat homely image that I think I made up myself, expressing your anger in a safe place with a safe person is like vomiting into the toilet while someone holds your forehead. It's hard, but you usually feel better afterwards, and you can think more clearly and more Christianly about what to do next. In the end, for a Christian, the Bible's teaching needs to lead the way. Anger is not to be extolled in our lives or in our discourse. Anger quickly becomes sin, and we simply must think in those terms. It is hard to do, given the climate in which we find ourselves. Gibbs wrote this before any of the crises we're currently facing happens. It's even harder now. We will have opportunities, however, to show ourselves to be different, spirit-filled sorts of people who respond with good when others have done evil, who leave vengeance in the hands of where it belongs, in God's hands. God says, vengeance is mine. We don't need to take vengeance. Gibbs says, my prayer should be, Lord, fill me with love for my neighbor and for those in need, so that I may serve and help them. So here's another practical thing when you're feeling yourself getting angry. Pray, Fill me with love for my neighbor and those in need, that I may serve and help them. And I would add, one practical way to avoid getting angry is to avoid putting yourself in positions that get you riled up. If you know that Facebook's going to trigger you to be mad at all kinds of people, either get off Facebook or hide posts. You can do that. Just click in the upper right-hand corner, snooze this person for 30 days. I don't want to get mad seeing what they write. And if you find yourself in a situation where you can't avoid those triggers and you feel your blood pressure boiling, immediately talk to God about it. He's real. He's listening. He can take it. and let him know how you're feeling. And then ask him for help so that you don't sin in your anger. So it's not good for God's kingdom. It's not good for you. What's good for you is to let God take vengeance where it's needed, to love your neighbor as yourself. When you're loving your neighbor instead of being angry at your neighbor, it not only helps your neighbor, you'll be better off for it too. And also for anyone who's ever sinned in your anger, you're forgiven. God's wrath was poured out on Christ on the cross. He doesn't hold your anger against you, and you are forgiven. God bless you.